There's something uniquely devastating about a child who vanishes. When an adult goes missing, we can at least construct theories about choice, about agency, about decisions made in moments of crisis. But when a 4-year-old boy disappears, those theories crumble. A 4-year-old doesn't run away. A 4-year-old doesn't start a new life somewhere else. A 4-year-old is utterly dependent on the adults around him for survival. Carlos Gill was 4 years old when he disappeared, but he didn't vanish alone. He disappeared with his entire family, his mother, his father, and his older brother. 4 people. Gone. Together. On February 8, 2002, the Gill family was living their normal lives in a small town in New Jersey. By February 9th, they had ceased to exist in any traceable way. No bodies were ever found. No witnesses came forward. No evidence of violence was discovered at their home. They simply weren't there anymore. 23 years have passed since that day. Carlos would be 27 years old now if he's still alive. Old enough to have finished college, started a career, maybe started a family of his own. But somewhere between the night of February 8th and the morning of February 9th, 2002, 4-year-old Carlos Gill and his family stepped out of reality. How does an entire family disappear without a trace? Not in the wilderness, not on a remote road, but from their own home, in a residential neighborhood, in one of the most densely populated states in America. And how does a case like this, 4 missing people, including 2 young children, remain unsolved for more than 2 decades? The questions multiply the deeper you look. Were they taken? Did they run? Were they victims of violence? Or did they vanish by choice? And perhaps most haunting of all, what happened to Carlos in those final hours? What does a 4-year-old understand when his world is falling apart around him? This is the story of the Gill family, of Ricky Gill, the father, of Layla Gill, the mother, of 8-year-old Robert, and of Carlos, the youngest, whose 4th year of life would be his last in the world anyone could find. Before they became a mystery, the Gills were a family. An ordinary family with ordinary struggles and ordinary hopes. Understanding who they were is crucial to understanding what might have happened to them. Ricardo Ricky Gill was born in the early 1970s. He grew up in New Jersey, part of a working-class family trying to make ends meet in an increasingly expensive state. Those who knew him in his younger years described him as ambitious but troubled. He wanted more than what his circumstances offered, but the path to getting it wasn't always clear or straight. By his late 20s, Ricky had accumulated some legal troubles. Nothing extraordinarily violent, but enough to create a record. Drug-related offenses, primarily. The kind of charges that stick to you in ways that make legitimate employment harder to find and keep. He wasn't a kingpin or a major player. He was someone caught in the cycle that traps so many people who grow up without many opportunities. But Ricky was also a father. And by most accounts, from those who knew him in the years before the disappearance, he loved his boys. He wanted to be there for them in ways perhaps his own father hadn't been there for him. He was trying, in his own complicated way, to build something better. Layla Gill was younger than Ricky by several years. She had grown up in a different kind of environment, but one with its own challenges. Friends and family members would later describe her as someone who wanted to believe in second chances, who saw the good in people even when others had written them off. This quality likely drew her to Ricky. She believed he could change, could become the man and father he wanted to be. They had 2 sons together, Robert, born in 1993, and Carlos, born in 1997. 4 years apart, the boys were at very different developmental stages in early 2002. Robert was 8 years old, in elementary school, old enough to understand and remember what was happening around him. Carlos was 4, still in that magical age of childhood, where the world is both enormous and contained entirely within the safety of your parents. The family lived in a modest home in Egg Harbor Township, New Jersey. Egg Harbor is part of Atlantic County, close enough to Atlantic City that its economy and culture are inevitably influenced by the casino city's presence. It's not a wealthy area, but it's not the poorest either. Suburban, working class, the kind of place where people know their neighbors but maybe don't talk to them every day. By early 2002, the Gill family was under stress, financial stress primarily. Ricky's employment situation was unstable. He would have periods of work followed by periods without it. Layla was doing what she could, but with 2 young children, her options were limited. They were behind on bills, behind on rent, The kind of behind that keeps you up at night wondering how you're going to keep a roof over your children's heads. There were other pressures too. Ricky's past wasn't just in the past. He had associations, connections to people involved in activities that existed in the gray and black markets. Whether he was actively involved in anything illegal at the time of the disappearance is unclear, but the connections were there. And in that world, debts don't just go away. Problems don't resolve themselves neatly. Friends who saw Layla in the weeks before the family vanished said she seemed anxious, worried. But when pressed, she wouldn't say exactly what was wrong. Just the usual stresses, she would say: money, life, the vague troubles that lots of families face. Robert was a bright kid, doing okay in school despite the instability at home. He liked sports, liked being outside, had friends in the neighborhood. He was old enough to sense when things weren't right at home, but probably not old enough to fully understand the nature of the problems his parents faced. And Carlos was 4. He liked trucks and cartoons. He was learning to ride a bike. He would start kindergarten in the fall if everything went according to plan. He depended entirely on his family for everything: food, shelter, safety, love. He had no ability to navigate the world on his own. This was the family that would disappear together. To understand what might have happened to the Gill family, you need to understand where they lived and when they lived there. Egg Harbor Township in 2002 was a community in transition. Located in Atlantic County, New Jersey, it sat in the shadow of Atlantic City, the gambling capital of the East Coast, before casinos spread to other states. Atlantic City brought jobs, tourism, and money to the region, but it also brought crime, addiction, and economic inequality. The early 2000s were a particular moment in this area's history. The initial boom that came with casino gambling in the 1970s and 80s had leveled off. Atlantic City was facing increasing competition from casinos in other states. The promise that gambling would revitalize the entire region had proven partially hollow. Yes, there were jobs. Yes, there was economic activity. But there was also a significant population struggling to make ends meet, living paycheck to paycheck in the expensive Northeast, while working service jobs in the casinos. This economic pressure created opportunities for illegal economies to flourish. Drug trafficking was a persistent problem in Atlantic County. The proximity to major highways and to Philadelphia and New York meant the area was a valuable corridor for moving drugs. Heroin, cocaine, and increasingly in the early 2000s, prescription opioids were flowing through the region. Violence, while not at the levels seen in larger cities, was present. Disputes over drug territory, money, and respect could turn deadly. And while high-profile murders might make the news, there were plenty of lower-level incidents that barely registered in public consciousness. People went missing. Debts were settled in ways that didn't involve courts or lawyers. The police in Egg Harbor Township were a relatively small force dealing with the spillover from Atlantic City and the local issues of a growing suburban community. They handled everything from routine traffic stops to drug investigations to domestic disputes. Resources were limited. Sophisticated investigative capabilities were limited. For most missing person cases, especially those involving adults who might have reasons to leave, the initial response was often to wait and see if the person turned up. The community itself was a mix. Some longtime residents whose families had been there for generations, newer arrivals drawn by jobs in the casinos or related industries, families struggling to stay in the middle class, families who had already slipped below it. The social fabric was neither particularly tight-knit nor completely atomized. People knew each other, but privacy was still valued and respected. In this environment, the Gill family was not unusual. They were one of many families dealing with economic pressure, one of many households where the adults had complicated pasts and uncertain futures. They were trying to make it work, but the margin for error was slim. What made them unusual was that they would all vanish at once, leaving behind a mystery that would remain unsolved for decades. February 2002 was cold in New Jersey. Winter was still firmly entrenched, with temperatures often below freezing and occasional snow. The kind of weather that makes you appreciate a warm home, that makes you want to stay inside with your family. In the first week of February, the Gill family was going through the routines of daily life, but those routines were fraying under pressure. Ricky had been in and out of work. There are indications he might have been involved in some kind of business dealing, possibly legitimate, possibly not. People who knew him during this time said he seemed preoccupied, not fearful exactly, but concerned, like someone trying to solve a problem that didn't have an easy solution. Layla had been making phone calls to family members, checking in, talking about ordinary things, but also asking questions about whether she and the boys could visit. Some family members would later say these conversations had an undertone they didn't recognize at the time. Like Layla was making sure connections were still there, making sure she could reach out if she needed to. Robert was in school, maintaining his normal schedule. His teachers didn't notice anything unusual. He seemed like the same kid he'd been all year, doing his work, playing with friends, being 8 years old. Carlos was in the daily care arrangement Layla had for him, playing with other kids, being 4. He had no awareness that anything was different or wrong. His world was still simple: home, family, toys, the basic patterns of childhood. The last few days before the disappearance, several things happened that would later seem significant. On February 6th, Ricky had a meeting with someone. Who this person was has never been definitively established. Some reports suggest it was related to a potential job. Others hint it might have been connected to his past associations. Whatever the meeting was about, Ricky came home from it in a particular mood, tense according to Layla's later description to a friend. On February 7th, Layla withdrew a small amount of cash from the family's bank account. Not a huge sum, they didn't have a huge sum to withdraw, but enough to cover a few days of expenses. Was this routine, or was she preparing for something? That same day, Robert told a friend at school that his family might be going on a trip soon. The friend didn't think much of it. Kids' families take trips. It wasn't strange. But the timing of this comment would later seem important. Had Robert overheard something? Had his parents told him they were going somewhere? February 8th was a Friday. Robert went to school as normal. Layla took Carlos to his daycare arrangement. Ricky was home for at least part of the day. Neighbors saw him outside in the afternoon doing something with the car. What exactly? They couldn't remember later. Just normal car-related activity. In the evening, the family was home together. One neighbor remembers seeing lights on at the Gill house around dinner time. Another neighbor thought they might have heard the family's car start up later in the evening, but they weren't sure. Memory is unreliable, especially when you're trying to remember something that seemed completely ordinary at the time. What happened in the Gill house that Friday evening? Did they have dinner together? Did the boys play before bedtime? Did Ricky and Layla talk about what was coming next? Or was there nothing coming? Was this just another Friday night? We don't know. We'll never know. Because sometime between the night of February 8th and the morning of February 9th, the Gill family disappeared. Saturday morning, February 9th, 2002, dawned cold and overcast in Egg Harbor Township. For most people, it was just another winter weekend day. Sleep in a little, maybe run errands. Normal life. But at the Gill house, there was no normal life happening. The first person to notice something was wrong was a family member. Reports vary on exactly who, but it appears to have been someone from Layla's side of the family who had expected to hear from her that morning. When phone calls went unanswered, concern started to build. By midday, this family member decided to drive to the Gill house to check on them. What they found was disturbing in its ordinariness. The house was locked. The family's car was gone. There were no signs of a struggle, no broken windows, no forced entry, no indication that anything violent had occurred. The house just looked like a house where the family had left, presumably in their car, to go somewhere. But they hadn't told anyone where they were going, and they weren't answering their phone. The family member tried not to panic. Maybe Ricky and Layla had decided to take an impromptu trip. Maybe they'd gone to visit someone and forgotten to mention it. People don't always communicate every movement. But as the day wore on and there was still no contact, worry deepened into fear. By Sunday, February 10th, it was clear something was seriously wrong. The family member contacted the police and filed a missing persons report. 4 people: Ricky Gill, age 31, Layla Gill, age 27, Robert Gill, age 8, Carlos Gill, age 4. The police response was initially measured. Adults have the right to go where they want, and it hadn't been very long. Maybe the family had left town for reasons of their own. Maybe they'd had some kind of emergency. Maybe they were staying with friends and had lost track of time. These are the rational explanations that police consider first, especially in cases where there's no immediate evidence of foul play. But certain facts made this case different from the start. 2 young children were missing. The family had apparently left without telling anyone where they were going, which was out of character according to relatives. And most importantly, Robert hadn't shown up for school on Monday, February 11th. School-aged children missing school without explanation is a red flag. It suggests something unplanned, something wrong. If the family had intentionally left for a trip, they would have called the school. They would have made arrangements. The fact that Robert simply didn't appear on Monday morning, with no explanation and no contact, elevated the case's urgency. Police went to the Gill house to conduct a more thorough examination. They had to be careful. Without evidence of a crime, they couldn't just break in. They had to follow procedures. But they were able to look through windows, talk to neighbors, and gather initial information. What they found suggested a rapid departure, but not a violent one. The house appeared relatively orderly. There was no blood, no signs of a struggle, no ransacking. Personal items were still inside. Some of the family's belongings were present, but other things seemed to be missing. Clothes, some toiletries, the kinds of things you'd take if you were going somewhere. Or the kinds of things someone might take if they were fleeing. The family's car, a detail that would become crucial, was gone. It was a distinct vehicle, one that should be relatively easy to spot. Police put out bulletins. An entire family in a specific car shouldn't be hard to find, right? But days passed, then weeks, and there was no sign of the Gill family's car. No sightings, no traffic stops, no parking tickets, nothing. It was as if the car, like the family, had simply ceased to exist. The investigation into the Gill family's disappearance faced challenges from the very beginning. How do you investigate a case where there's no crime scene, no witnesses, and no clear indication of what actually happened? The lead detective assigned to the case started with the basics: interview family members, interview friends, interview neighbors, talk to Robert's school, talk to anyone who had contact with the family in the days before they vanished, build a timeline, look for patterns. What emerged from these interviews was a picture of a family under stress but not in immediate crisis. Financial troubles, yes, but lots of families had financial troubles. Ricky's complicated past, yes, but he seemed to be trying to stay out of trouble. There were no reports of domestic violence, no indication that Layla was afraid of Ricky or planning to leave him, no suggestion that they were in immediate danger. But there were hints. Small, ambiguous hints. One of Ricky's acquaintances mentioned that Ricky had been worried about something in the weeks before he disappeared. What was he worried about? The acquaintance wasn't sure. Money. Maybe. Or maybe something to do with people from his past. It was vague, frustratingly vague. Another person mentioned seeing Ricky with someone unfamiliar in the days before the disappearance. Who was this person? What did they look like? Again, the description was frustratingly vague. Just some guy. Average height, dark jacket, the kind of description that could fit thousands of people. Layla's family tried to help but were limited in what they knew. Layla had been somewhat private about the details of her life with Ricky. She loved him, they knew that. She loved her boys, that was beyond question. But she didn't share everything. And now, in retrospect, they wondered if there were things she'd been keeping from them. Things she'd been protecting them from knowing. The investigation into Ricky's activities in the months before the disappearance revealed some concerning connections. He had been in contact with people involved in drug distribution. The exact nature of his involvement was unclear. Was he using? Dealing? Just staying in touch with old friends? The line between social connection and criminal conspiracy can be blurry. Investigators looked into the possibility that Ricky had gotten involved in something over his head, that he owed money to dangerous people, that the family's disappearance was connected to this criminal underworld. This theory had some merit but also some problems, which we'll explore in depth later. They also had to consider the possibility that the family had left voluntarily, that Ricky and Layla, facing mounting pressure of some kind, had decided to run, to take the boys and start over somewhere else with new identities. It sounds dramatic, but people have done it before. People do it more often than you might think. But voluntary disappearance didn't fit perfectly either. Why abandon all their extended family without a word? Why traumatize Robert by pulling him out of school without explanation? And even if Ricky and Layla had reasons to run, where did they go? How did they survive without accessing bank accounts or using credit cards? The car became a critical piece of the investigation. If they could find the car, they might find the family, or at least find evidence of what happened to them. All points bulletins went out across New Jersey and neighboring states. Police checked impound lots. They monitored traffic cameras, though in 2002 such cameras were far less prevalent than they are now. Weeks turned into months, and the car didn't surface. It was as if it had been driven into another dimension. Investigators also looked into the possibility of foul play followed by disposal of the bodies. Could someone have killed the entire family and hidden the bodies? It's a grim scenario, but one that had to be considered. But where would you hide 4 bodies? And more importantly, where would you hide a car? Dumping a car is harder than dumping a body. Cars are big, distinctive, trackable. You can't just bury a car in your backyard. Some investigative resources went into searching nearby areas for the car and for possible burial sites. Fields, wooded areas, bodies of water where a car might have been driven in and submerged. But New Jersey, despite being a small state, has a lot of places to hide things. And without specific leads pointing to specific locations, they were searching blindly. The media got involved, which brought both help and complications. Local news ran stories about the missing family. 4 people, including 2 young children, vanished without a trace. It was the kind of story that captured attention. Tips came in, dozens of them. Someone thought they saw the family in Pennsylvania. Someone else was sure they'd seen them in Florida. Someone saw a car that looked like the Gills' car at a rest stop in Delaware. Every tip had to be followed up on, and every tip led nowhere. The sightings were cases of mistaken identity. The car that looked like the Gills' car was someone else's car. The family's trail remained completely cold. As the investigation stretched from weeks into months into its first year, the challenges compounded. Memory fades. Evidence degrades. People move on. And without new leads, without new evidence, the investigation began to lose momentum. But for the family members left behind, time didn't erase anything. It only deepened the agony of not knowing. The disappearance of the Gill family became a local sensation, and eventually attracted regional and even some national attention. 4 people vanishing together, including 2 young children, was unusual enough to generate significant media interest. In the early days and weeks after the disappearance, the coverage was sympathetic and focused on the search. Photos of the family circulated. Descriptions of what they might be wearing, where they might be. The car's make, model, and license plate were widely distributed. "Have you seen this family?" became a familiar question on local news broadcasts. But as time went on without resolution, the nature of the coverage began to shift. The sympathetic search coverage gave way to speculation and theory. And in that speculation, the family, particularly Ricky and Layla, were subjected to a different kind of scrutiny. Ricky's criminal history became a focal point. News reports detailed his past drug charges. The implication was clear. This wasn't just an innocent family that fell victim to random violence. This was a family connected to criminal activity, and their disappearance was probably connected to that world. Was this fair? Partially. Ricky's past was relevant to understanding what might have happened, but it also had the effect of making some people care less. There's an unfortunate tendency in these cases to view victims through a moral lens, to decide whether they were innocent enough to deserve full public sympathy. A family with a squeaky clean background disappearing would generate one level of outcry. A family where the father had a drug record generated something more muted. Layla faced her own form of judgment. Why had she stayed with Ricky? Why had she exposed her children to whatever danger he might have brought into their lives? Never mind that she might have loved him, might have believed he was changing, might have had her own complicated reasons for her choices. The court of public opinion doesn't deal in complexity. Robert and Carlos, as children, were spared this kind of scrutiny. But their images circulated endlessly. School photos of Robert. A family snapshot of Carlos. These images became frozen in time. Robert at 8, Carlos at 4, forever children in the public imagination even as the years passed, and they would have grown into teenagers, and then young men, if they were still alive. Some media coverage focused on theories. Could the family have been victims of a drug-related hit? Could they have witnessed something they shouldn't have and been killed to keep them quiet? Could Ricky have been in witness protection and the family relocated? Each theory was explored, debated, and ultimately left hanging without resolution. True crime forums on the early internet picked up the case. In the mid-2000s, these forums were becoming popular spaces for amateur sleuths to discuss unsolved cases. The Gill case had all the elements that make for engaging discussion: mystery, multiple victims, various possible theories, and very few confirmed facts. People argued back and forth about what must have happened, often with great certainty and very little actual evidence. Some of these online theorists were respectful, genuinely trying to help solve the case. Others were less so, treating the family's tragedy as entertainment, a puzzle to be solved for their own satisfaction. For the Gill family's relatives, this media coverage was a double-edged sword. On one hand, they wanted attention on the case. Attention meant someone might remember something, might come forward with information. Attention kept pressure on law enforcement to keep investigating. But on the other hand, the coverage was often painful. Seeing your loved ones discussed like characters in a story rather than real people who were loved and missed was agonizing. And there was another complication. The media coverage sometimes contained misinformation. Details would get reported incorrectly and then repeated by other outlets. Timelines would get confused. Names would be misspelled. And once something incorrect was published, it would circulate forever, becoming part of the permanent record of the case even if it wasn't true. The family members tried to do interviews to keep the case alive, to humanize their missing relatives, to emphasize that these were real people who deserved to be found. Layla's mother gave several interviews over the years, always emphasizing the same points. Layla was a good mother who loved her boys. Robert was a bright kid, with his whole life ahead of him. Carlos was just a baby, an innocent child who deserved to be safe. But as the years passed, media interest waned. New cases emerged. New disappearances captured attention. The Gill case became old news, brought up occasionally on anniversaries, or when there was a slow news day, but no longer a focus of sustained coverage. By the time the case reached its 10th anniversary in 2012, media coverage was minimal. A few retrospective pieces, some social media posts from people who remembered the case, but the intense scrutiny of the early years was gone. The family had become a footnote, a cold case, a mystery that would likely never be solved. More than 2 decades after the Gill family disappeared, we still don't know what happened to them. But several theories have emerged over the years, each with varying levels of credibility. Theory 1. Drug-related violence. This is perhaps the most widely discussed theory based largely on Ricky's history and connections. The theory goes like this. Ricky was involved in drug dealing or owed money to people in the drug trade. When he couldn't pay, or when a deal went wrong, these dangerous people came after him. Rather than just killing Ricky, they killed the entire family to send a message or to eliminate potential witnesses. Evidence supporting this theory includes Ricky's known connections to people involved in drug distribution, reports that he seemed worried in the weeks before the disappearance, and the fact that the family vanished completely, which could suggest they were killed and their bodies disposed of. But there are problems with this theory. First, killing an entire family, including 2 young children, would be extraordinarily risky and attention-drawing. Drug dealers are criminals, but most of them are rational criminals. They avoid heat. Murdering 4 people, including kids, would bring massive law enforcement attention, which is the last thing a drug operation wants. Second, if the family was killed, where are the bodies? And more puzzling, where is the car? Disposing of 4 bodies is one challenge. Disposing of a car is another. Both would need to be done in a way that left no trace for over 20 years. It's possible, but it requires significant resources and planning. Third, there's no evidence of violence at the house. If the family was killed there, there should be blood, signs of struggle, something. If they were lured away and killed elsewhere, why would they all go willingly? Would Layla put her children in the car to go meet her husband's dangerous associates? Theory 2. Voluntary disappearance. This theory suggests that Ricky and Layla, facing some kind of threat or unbearable pressure, decided to disappear voluntarily. They took the boys and went into hiding, possibly with new identities.